Hello everybody, welcome to Crafty Soup. My name is Misty and today I am joining the Mixed Media Frenzy group for their Friday Hop. And if you don't know what this group is, I'll leave links to you so you can find them on Facebook and join in the fun. Here's the inspiration piece that we're all working from along this hop. From this piece I'm going to take elements of florals, of drippy colors, and of a row of photos set up high. The first thing I'm going to do is pull out a sheet of Basil heavy-duty cardstock. I think it's called double thick cardstock. There we go. And I'm going to go ahead and gesso this. And I'm gessoing it to fill in the pores of the paper so that when I do my inky techniques, the ink can release from my surface and do flowing that I want it to do. Now I'm going to use these 4 smaller photos. These are about 2 by 3 inches in size, and I'm going to create the row of photos going across like in the inspiration piece, and I'm going to set them up higher. Instead of doing washes of color like in the inspiration, I'm actually going to do some watercolor stenciling, and I'm going to show you a couple of different ways to use these stencils to get a watercolor look. So there will be several techniques along the way. Now this is a layering stencil from Pink Fresh Studio that creates that little scene there that you see there. Because it's made for cards, I'm going to do a few things to get it to fit for my scrapbooking. So before I get started on that, of course I have to pick my colors, and so I go through a long process of trying to decide which colors I want to use, and I am picking colors out of my photo for this. Once I've chosen all of my colors, I'm going to lay these stencils out in order with each color that I'm going to use for that stencil. Pink Fresh numbers their stencils, and it's not going to show up on camera, but there's a little etch mark in there and also alignment guides in there that help you use these stencils. So I line those up with the colors that I'm going to use in the order that I'm going to use them to kind of help make things easier. I am going to go ahead and protect my surface so that my workspace is good. I'm going to pull out blender brushes, and while I have these labeled for color separation, because I'm using the Oxide inks, which have some pigment in them, you are going to need to wash them when you're done. So I line up my stencil with the edge of my paper, and like I said, because these are made for card making, I'm going to have to adjust my alignment as I work. And then I go ahead and ink up my first layer. Now because this layer is going to be more in the background, I am going to use a lighter color, and that helps the eye read it as it being in the background. Because the stencil left a gap at the top of my paper, I did fill that in more. Oh, there I had grabbed the wrong blender brush because I was talking to my daughter and I had to correct that mistake. Luckily I could just spritz it with water and soak up the reactivated ink and then just do it again. Once I've worked my way across the entire length of the paper, I'm going to give it a spritz with water, and it's going to really pool up those images and start dripping, and mostly you're going to lose the detail of the images. So what I'm going to do next is add in a couple more crisp spots of inking on this, and then I will clean up those materials and set those aside and move on to the next step. This process is going to be a lot of layers, and I'm going to dry my paper off camera in between with my heat tool, so this is going to be a lot of layers back and forth. This next layer, I pulled out my photos, gave myself a little mark, and then I'm going to add more drips of that same color going down this page. I swipe my pad across where I know it's going to be hidden, add some water, and let it drip. And then I'm ready to move on to the second stencil in this. And I use a darker color for this. And then I decided this was a better drip technique to use up that extra ink that's on my stencil. So I just spray it over a rag and let it drip onto my paper, and then tilt my paper to get that to drip down. And after that is drippy, here is my second tip for you for getting a watercolor look out of stencils. And that is just to give a light mist across your color, and that will start to bleed out your image, but you're not going to lose the detail of the image as long as you don't add too much water. I am doing the next layer in this, which is the flowers. I am rotating the stencil and moving it around so that I can get a variety so it doesn't look too repetitive. And I add my drips like I did with the other stencils. Now, drips can tend to follow previous pathways, so keep that in mind. And I am purposefully adding extra pathways to this so that I can get separate drips. So this next tip that I'm giving you for using stencils to watercolor is to just dip a paintbrush in clean water and start painting over the top of the image. I do go outside the lines just a tiny bit, and that's going to cause your ink to flow and bleed, and the gesso is going to help with that as well. Here's the next layer, and I'm putting the yellow down into this. So I did end up with a color palette very similar to the sample packaging that comes from Pink Fresh, and that's okay. That's why they put those samples there. So I'm going to go ahead and add the drips of yellow to my page. And as I was dripping that yellow on there, or as I was spraying the stencil to get the drips, I accidentally ended up with a fine mist of yellow on the edge of my paper. And you'll see me here in a minute realize, oh, there, I realized, and then I tried to purposefully do it on the other side, and I couldn't figure out how I had gotten that to happen. And I just kind of ended up making a puddly mess on that side of the paper. So I am going to go ahead and soak up that puddly mess and do my best to fix it in a way that's satisfying. So here's the final technique with using stencils to look like watercoloring, and I'm just adding a dot of water to the center of these tiny flowers as I go, and it's going to bleed the color out to the edge and give you more of a gradient look. So for this final stencil, I could not eyeball where it was supposed to go. So I'm using a previous stencil from this kit, lining it up with where the ink was, and then putting my final stencil right on top of that, and then sliding the bottom stencil out of the way so that alignment is going to be just right for these stencils. And I move on to the very last stencil in the darkest color, and honestly, I'm looking at this and I am not loving it. So I got that green drip going on, and I looked at this and I thought that last layer did not make me happy at all. It felt too busy. It felt like the flowers had lost their definition. So I added a lot of water to that final layer, and I just tapped up excess ink with a tissue as it reactivated that ink, so that layer would end up being much more subtle. And now I'm adding another layer of stenciling on top of my watercolored flowers to give them a little more of dimension with that extra layer, a little more depth, and a little more pop against all of that kind of green busyness. And then I'm going to give my flower some details by adding speckles into the center of the flowers, and then just some little squiggly, scribbly lines around some of the edges of the petals. I know some of this stuff is hard to see as I'm working on it, but I will give you close-up photos later so that you can see the details of things. I bring my photos back into the screen. I fill in any spaces that feel a little too empty. And then I'm going to go ahead and move on to one more piece that I felt like was missing from this. And this is kind of a matte area for those photos to pop a little bit more off the busy background. So I'm just going to use the ink left over from that flower stencil. I'm adding a little more ink onto the stencil, both in yellow and in that kind of orangey red. I believe that's Barn Door. And I'm going to go ahead and kind of mix these two colors as I go around, and I'm just adding a wishy-washy matte all the way around where my photos are going to be. I'm going to mount my photos on all these leftover scraps of foam that I have from another project, and then that will give my photos even more pop and dimension off the background. And then I pull out foam letters that I die cut myself, so I would have plenty of letters to work with, and I spell out my title. And then I know I want my journaling to go diagonally from my title. That's a tip I often use to get a diagonal visual flow in. I try to reactivate the ink in the area where I know my journaling is going to go to try and mute that color back down, but once I've heat set it, that ink seems to be more permanent. So it's good to know if you heat set your Oxide inks, they're going to be more permanent. I go ahead and give myself some stamping lines for my journaling, and then I like to add scribbly borders, especially to really busy backgrounds, so that it kind of helps contain all of the funk to make it feel cohesive. So then I got this in my brain after doing the little stippling on the flowers that I wanted to add a stippling border with that watercolor border that I did for those photos. And I'm going to concentrate the stippling right up next to the edge of the borders and kind of dilute it out as I move away from the photos. and I really liked how it came out. I did have to sit in front of the TV for maybe an hour-long show to get all the stippling done, but it was actually kind of soothing, and I really like how it came out. So after I finished the stippling, I did leave it sitting overnight. I came back the next day to try and figure out what embellishing I wanted to do. I know the inspiration had a frame around a main photo, and I tried to pull something like that in, and I just could not figure it out. I tell you, when I get to this point in a mixed media layout, I'm usually feeling pretty done, just like physically, emotionally done. And then also, I just cannot figure out what to do with embellishing at this point, and nothing really quite feels right. So I did decide I wanted a little bit of journaling on each photo, so I made little tabs and flags to do that. I pulled out some flowers to see if I could add more flowers in here. I did try inking them up to get them to match my project, and I set those aside to dry, and in the meantime I was just playing with arranging some plain flowers. And I do end up sticking those down just because they're subtle enough that they're not pulling attention away from everything else, but they add a little bit of detail and texture. But to be honest, I'm really not loving them, so I wish I had just stopped and left them off. I did add some of these little crystal jewels on there, which I actually do like those. Those were pretty. I'm not sure I made the most effective use of them, but I like them. And so I'll just have to think harder on that. So yeah, when I'm embellishing these mixed media layouts, I tell you, I am just not sure where to go. I try pulling out more bits and pieces, and it's just not speaking to me. So I probably should have just stopped when I felt like I needed to stop. At any rate, let's go ahead and take a final look at some close-ups. Here is the overall layout where you can see all of the elements that I've got going on. And then if we take a close-up look at the flowers and the stenciling and watercoloring techniques, you can see those yellow flowers where I added a touch of water to the center. You can see how it lightens up the center and pushes more of the pigment out to the edges. You can also see the red flowers, how I've got a little bit of layering going on with that watercolor layer and then the stencil layer on top, as well as the pen work that I've done to add just a little bit of detail. Sometimes those little touches can really help things pop and be interesting. And then here's just a final look at that embellishing that I did around my journaling block. Again, maybe not the best idea, but it's there, it's done. So that's it for my video on this hop. Do remember that there are plenty of other crafters out there who have got their work going on, and you can see how they took their inspiration and perhaps how they were a little bit more successful with their embellishing than I was. So go check them out and leave them some love. Thank you for joining me. I will be back on August 1st, which is the beginning of the month, which means it is counterfeit kit building time for me. So do come join me then.